Okay, I'm David Zajic. I'm a research scientist in computational linguistics over at the Center for Advanced Study of Language, where I do work in second language learning and computational lexicography.
All right, I'm Professor Frank Cole. I'm a professor in environmental science and technology and director of the Gemstone Honors Program.
Hello, I'm Kristen Skendel, Associate Director of the Gemstone Honors Program.
I'm Nick Diakopoulos, an assistant professor in the College of Journalism, study computational journalism.
Hi, I'm Philip Resnick, and you've done your research, so you know all about me already. I'm split as a professor between the Department of Linguistics and the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies. I'm a primarily natural language processing / computational linguistics person, and I am particularly interested these days in computational social science.
Okay.
Okay, and now it's your turn.
And we are Team BIASES, Bilingual Internet Approaches to Systematically Examine Sources. I'm Elliot Frank, Cassidy Laidlaw, Brianna Caljean. So I'm sure, again, like background information, everyone kind of has an idea. You know, we're going to be looking at biases on multilingual Wikipedia, but what does that entail? Okay, so for the first two parts of our presentation, the literature review and motivating examples, we're going to try and like justify, give some background information and justify like why we think this is a rich area to study and do research on for 3 more years. Then for defining bias and defining kind of our research problem, just laying some groundwork of like terms that we think everyone needs to know that we can go forward and do our research. And then the 5th bullet point is, you know, our methodology is like the how of the research. Okay, so I'm sure everyone's familiar with Wikipedia, obviously. It's like the crowdsourced encyclopedia. This question just naturally, like, is Wikipedia biased? I think it's kind of a funny one because, you know, some people will be like, yeah, of course it's biased because anyone can log into Wikipedia and put whatever made up information they want. But at the same time, it's like widely used by a lot of people. I'm sure everyone, like, even sometimes in your work, you use Wikipedia just if you like forget a concept. And to that end, Wikipedia obviously doesn't want to be seen as biased, right? So they have a lot of measures, so stuff like neutral point of view, where they're trying to, you know, explicitly in their policies say we don't want biased information. And they have, you know, little like stickers like that they put up if they think a certain article is biased, and editors try and moderate that. But then there are also features of Wikipedia that you may not be familiar with. So I'm sure everyone in this room uses the English edition of Wikipedia, so you might not realize that there's also a Spanish language edition of Wikipedia and a Russian language edition of Wikipedia. And generally those are edited by different sets of people. It's edited by people that Spanish or English is their first language. So what people have done research like computationally on the different editions and found that there's actually a lot of different information because of these different editors. So that graphic is from researchers at Northwestern. So if you like key in the conspiracy theory article and find that in each different language, those little like points are, so the blue is the different links that just appear in the English version versus the like yellow are just the links that are like German conspiracy theories that don't actually cross across languages. So, and they found that only like 15% of the information generally about like, say, conspiracy theories occurs like across all languages. So there's really not like a global encyclopedia of, you know, this is all the human knowledge. It's really subject to these like local changes in language. So people have found that via some computerized studies already. And we wanted to go into the actually like reading Wikipedia and see if, you know, are these things like, can you find these differences in information yourselves? Are they like manifest at a human readable level? So Brie will talk about the motivating examples for that.
So we had a few members of our team go into Wikipedia to basically see if we could see any surface level differences from just a very, very rough preliminary reading of the information. We looked at articles in the Cold War, which is our case study, which we'll explain about a little bit. We'll talk about a little bit later. So in the article on the Cuban Missile Crisis, we looked at the English edition, the Spanish edition, and the Russian edition using the interlanguage links and then Google Translate for the entire page, just because we wanted a rough idea of what information we'd be getting. We found that in that Cuban Missile Crisis article, there was a difference in the information presented. Basically, the Spanish edition presented regionalized information about the Venezuelan ships blockading of Cuba that did not appear in either the English edition or the Russian edition. Also in that same article, the Russian edition had many references and outgoing links on military information that was not present in the other 2 editions of Wikipedia. Then looking at an article on Sputnik using the same process of translation, we found that the English edition of Wikipedia had information on social consequences of the launch and the space race, whereas the Spanish editions and the Russian edition both only had information on the scientific consequences of the launching of Sputnik. So from that, we kind of gathered a definition of bias that we're going to work with, and it's said to be imbalances in information presented, as opposed to having a totally unbiased article. We're going to focus on the differences between the articles. So basically our problem is that in social sciences research there are large corpora of information presented in multiple languages that would be a very tedious process to kind of go in and annotate by hand and for professors doing research. So we're going to see if we can come up with a computer model that can mimic kind of what a human would do and finding the same kinds of bias in the corpora. And to do this, we're going to look at the case study of Latin America during the Cold War. And we chose this because during the Cold War, Latin America kind of had influences from both sides of the spectrum, both English and Russian. And so we're going to see if we can place the Latin American articles along a spectrum in between Russian viewpoint and the English viewpoint. So we've developed this 3-viewpoint model where we're going to use the Spanish editions as a target viewpoint, and we're going to look at it and see if the information presented more closely mimics the Russian or more closely mimics the English edition. So for example, if we take the case of Sputnik, since the Spanish edition had scientific consequences of it, and so did the Russian, we'd be able to place that closer to the Russian viewpoint on the spectrum. Going through our methodology, we first have to compile a corpus. So we're just going to go through compile a corpus, and then so our second phase is going to be kind of parallel human evaluation with computer evaluation of the articles. After that, we'll go and look at our results, refine our techniques, and then improve our model. So now Cassie is going to tell you about our methodology.
Yeah, so as Brianna said, our methodology is mainly split up into 2 phases. So the first phase is actually compiling a corpus of Wikipedia articles that relate to our topic, which is the Cold War. And we're going to do that using a basic graph search algorithm on Wikipedia. So we're basically going to start at a seed article, the Cold War, and then follow the outgoing links from that article to find other related articles. And we're going to incorporate some kind of text similarity measure, like the TF-IDF cosine measure, that will determine whether an article is similar enough to the original seed article to actually be included in the corpus. So in this case, James Bond might be linked to by the Cold War page, but we don't really want to include that in our corpus. And then finally, we'll probably do this in one language and then expand it to other languages through the interlanguage links that Wikipedia has built in. And so that will get us this whole set of articles in all 3 languages, English, Russian, and Spanish. The next phase of our methodology is to have humans evaluate bias within this corpus. So we're going to have people who are native Spanish speakers go through articles in Spanish on the Cold War and determine whether they fall more towards the English viewpoint or the Russian viewpoint. And so we have a few sample questions up here that we're thinking about asking, but we're actually working now to develop the annotation scheme more. So that will be finalized soon. The next phase is we're going to try to do the same thing, but using computers, so doing it automatically. And the first step in that phase is to train a multilingual topic model over all 3 Wikipedias, so English, Russian, and Spanish. And we plan to use a slight variation on the traditional latent Dirichlet allocation, so that's the standard topic modeling technique that incorporates multiple languages. So basically, if you know what these plate diagrams mean, then there's an extra latent variable, which is there's an extra variable, which is the language, and there's an extra latent variable, which kind of represents a set of words that are the same in different languages. And so based on that topic model, we'll condense these three Wikipedias into a single set of kind of language-independent topics. And then based on that, we're going to use a regression model where we will place English and Russian articles at opposite ends of a spectrum. So basically within the regression model, we'll give them a value of like 1 for one end and -1 for the other. and then we'll train a regression model over those, the English and Russian articles, and then we'll be able to place Spanish articles along the spectrum by seeing where the regression model has them fall between -1 and 1. So once we have the scores...
I'm sorry,
yeah.
go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
What role does the sentiment annotation play? It's not actually playing any role in this process as far as I can see.
Are you talking about from like the human evaluation? Or-
Yes, what would be, that's right.
So we were thinking that possibly if this topic modeling approach doesn't work out, we could look into sentiment more. And if we do the annotations, we only want to do them once. So we figured we may as well try to get as much information as we can.
So I understand from a different perspective. So the human sentiment evaluation and your computer-derived array are two parallel methods for evaluation.
Right. And
Okay.
so basically we want to compare whether the computer can produce similar results to what the humans
Okay.
come up with.
Got it.
Right. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to compare the human results with the computer results, and basically see if they correlate using standard statistical correlation measures like Pearson's R or Spearman's Rho, and that will give us an idea of how well our process works. And then Elliot's going to talk about where we go from there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so after that, process, there's like a lot of directions we could go. Sorry. Okay, so one thing we could look at is more ways to identify bias. So like again, the main technique we're using is topic modeling. But yeah, just what we were saying. Maybe later. So one thing is like if it worked and we saw there's correlation, maybe we want to go deeper. So it'd be looking at bias in like the sentence level. So that would be looking at sentiment analysis, and then that would be considering what we got from those human evaluations. We would take that into consideration. Of course, if the topic modeling didn't work, maybe we would try a different technique anyway, so we might kind of end up here. Then there's the other idea of, again, so if it turns out like Wikipedia is unbiased and there's like no correlation, maybe we would want to try the same methods on different corpora. Or kind of, if it was really biased, we would maybe want to look at different areas of Wikipedia, so you could look at something like the Holocaust and different language versions there. Then there's the idea of, we haven't really talked yet about using metadata, and this is something we're looking more into, but there is a lot of metadata on Wikipedia of like when articles were created and who was editing the articles, so that could maybe factor into a project to go more in depth. And then finally there's this idea of, so kind of the general arc of the project, we're trying to unite kind of the human readability and like a computer readability, right, and see like, can we get the same kind of interpretation of articles? So if we found like one pervasive instance of bias, right, we like, oh, they all tend to skew these articles this way. I really think like interesting thing to do would be then to look in like the scholarship of like historiography of the Cold War maybe, and see if we can kind of unite like what humanities scholars have been saying of like why this bias would appear with what we found through these computer methods. So this is the team timeline. So this semester we've been working on phase 1, which again is collecting that corpus. We kind of laid out our own like internal deadlines for that. So hopefully that will be done by the summer. Along with that, we're also starting to think about how we're going to do that annotation scheme. So basically the people that aren't doing the code are like on the annotation team. And then with that, if we think we need IRB approval to get those human annotations, we're also looking into that this semester. And then hopefully by the summer and then into the fall semester, we would start to actually put that annotation scheme into practice and also start to work on the topic modeling, like coding up the joint LDA algorithm, like the multilingual LDA, and then using it. And then from there, we would, if it works all within that window, then yeah, we would have a lot of time to go into those further directions and see what we found. So here are references, and we'll now be taking questions. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you. So we didn't interrupt you very much, so I'm sure there's a lot of pending questions, comments. We have a tradition of starting our question with our outside readers, so we can flip a coin or someone can go first.
I jumped in already, but if you...
Well, I have a number of questions. I think this is really interesting, and one of the things that I wanted to hone in on was the methodology that you're developing for selecting your corpus, because I think that's sort of another element of bias that you know you're kind of constructing this corpus, and therefore what you read out as the outcome could have everything to do with how you created that corpus. So the things I'm thinking about are like, how are the linking patterns in Wikipedia biased? So if you're using this, essentially what is a network approach to building that corpus, is there any research that's been done that lays out what the bias is in the linking patterns? I assume there are some types of you know, biases embedded in that. And then, I mean, I guess that kind of leads to the next question, which is, you know, if you can download the entire language version of each of these Wikipedias, could you instead use a language model to select across that entire corpus and kind of skip the bias that you would inject into your corpus construction by having to follow links?
And by the way, there's a postdoc who's been working with me who actually has a method for data selection.
Okay.
You give it a seed set of stuff and say, find me more stuff like this.
Right.
That does use a language modeling approach, and it's possible that that could be useful, and there will be code.
So, for instance,
useful.
you would just define what your seed set is, you know, which again injects a set of biases based on how you selected that seed set. But at least you're like cognizant of like, these are really the things that we are biasing toward, and then you run Philip's postdoc's code and
or whatever, yeah.
or whatever, and out pops, you know, a set of other articles that are similar enough to that seed set. So you might want to think about that a little bit more. I guess the other source of bias that I'm thinking about that might be present based on your methodology is sort of related to, you know, how do you account for articles that are present in one language but not in another? Because I can sort of seeing that lead to, you know, your English corpus is essentially different than your Russian or your Spanish corpus because there just aren't articles on some topics in these other languages. So you know, do you really, what you want to do really the intersection of, you know, do you want to make sure that like every topic is represented in every language so that you're making sure that some things aren't overrepresented? So that's another potential source of bias. And then the last point that I'll make, and then you know, other people can jump in, is just a question about Spanish Wikipedia. Is it homogeneous? Is there one Spanish version of Wikipedia?
Meaning?
Yeah,
Meaning
there's one.
like everyone in South America who
Right.
speaks Spanish, some of whom speak slightly different versions of Spanish, and also the people in Spain,
Yeah.
they all contribute to the same Wikipedia,
Mhm.
Spanish Wikipedia.
Although there's, yeah.
Right.
So that also could cause bias in terms of different nationality or cultural, like the Spanish world is not homogeneous, right? I mean, yeah, they speak the same language, like in the same way that we speak the same language as Scottish people, which I don't know, like I'm part Scottish, and those relatives are kind of hard to understand sometimes. So it is homogeneous, but it's also not homogeneous, and so something that you could sort of think about digging into is, you know, the IP addresses of who's actually edited those pages, right? So can you actually look at, are there nationality type biases in terms of like, oh, this article was really interesting to Chilean editors for some reason, and so you see a strong edit pattern from that particular
Yeah.
perspective.
No, totally. I mean, part of that was, I think, kind of we were trying to like allude to that with like the using the metadata, like that might be something kind of we like interject into the method. Also there's like maybe I would want to like look into it more, but people have done research on like, you know, so articles about things that happen in the US tend to get overrepresented in the English Wikipedia. So there may be like we may be able to like look more into it, but there may be some evidence already that like if you're looking at articles about like events in Latin America, there would already be this sort of like selection that like authors from Latin America tend to write more about that than Spanish authors. But yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. It's something like we've kind of like struggled with and we'll still keep thinking about.
I'd like to interject a follow-up question to that. I don't have a concept of what your N value or your corpus is. How many articles?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I don't know if it's 20 or 20,000.
Rough order of magnitude?
Maybe around 1,000, I would say.
Okay.
I don't know.
I don't know if that's large or small. My thought is the variability you're going to be dealing with from a pure statistical evaluation point of view, you have to have a pretty big sample set. Okay.
The one other thing is that, kind of going off what Elliot said, there was also another study that was trying to basically place Wikipedia editors, because sometimes you can do it by the IP, but Wikipedia doesn't track the IP of like registered users.
Oh, right.
And so those users, they were basically able to pinpoint them by the articles they edited that were referring to a specific location. So they found that people's edits tended to like be focused on, so if you edit like an article about Central Park and like the Rockefeller Center, you're probably in New York City. So that's another that also provides some evidence that maybe if you're talking about events in Latin America, they would be more edited by people who live there.
Yeah, the other potential source of sort of bias infiltration that I see in this is, Russia has kind of a unique media system, I guess, when you're comparing the English, Spanish, and Russian, in the sense that it's essentially authoritarian. I mean, the media is totally controlled by the state. And I wonder to what extent the Russian state media is infiltrating Wikipedia in order to represent sort of, their view on these events.
Right.
And therefore, whether or not, I guess it's just a matter of what you're measuring. I mean, in that sense, I guess you would be measuring the state bias in the Russian version of Wikipedia, which is a little bit different than, in the U.S. we maybe don't have the same type of representational challenge. I don't know if that comment made sense, but
It did, and tie that back to my question about variability. So if that's true, your variability within your endpoint on the Russian end would be very small, and your variability on your English version on the other end of your spectrum would be quite wide, because you'd have more variability within that endpoint.
That might predict that you could actually instrument this. You might be able to get higher inter-annotator agreement in one language versus another.
You could actually be measured, and would be interesting to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also just generally, like, I think one thing that could end up happening is, like, our conclusions are all just kind of like this is how, the Russian Wikipedia functions, and this is, like, the culture of the English Wikipedia, and this is the culture of the Spanish Wikipedia. But I still think that would be, like, interesting. I mean, people have already kind of talked about, like, one thing is, like, the people that edit Wikipedia, like, tend to be, like, or English Wikipedia at least, like, tend to be, like, white and male and, like, pretty young. And people have then been looking at, like, does that affect what topics? So some people have already done research on, like, the culture, quote-unquote, of Wikipedia. And I think that's still, like, an interesting...
That's a good way to think about it. Whenever you design a study, you should always try to design it in such a way that if it fails, it hasn't failed. No, I mean that seriously. You should design an experiment such that you will learn something from it, even if it does not work out the way that you were hoping it would. So what you just said is the kind of thinking that you want to do, and you have to be agile as you go along as well.
Yep. We'll continue?
Yeah, well, I have a bunch of comments, and if I start running too long, stop me,
Okay.
and what I can do is at the very end just like blurt them out, and you'll have notes in the video or whatever it is. But so I'll start with the things that I think are... So I have three categories, substance, methods, and logistical stuff. So first of all, cool stuff, and very timely in the social sciences. There is a rising trend of interest in this sort of thing. And also on the technical side, seeing this as a very cool application area because of this ability, the real need to be able to scale up the kinds of analyses that people like to do. At the same time, it's a niche within a niche. In political science, for example, you have sort of political science, and then you have the quants who do statistics, who are already sort of viewed with suspicion by some people, and then within that you have like the computational modelers who are viewed with even more suspicion. So it's very timely, and you want to be aware of what community you're speaking to.
Right.
And especially as you're moving toward being a senior and like where you want to go from here, you're going to want to think about which sub-communities you're thinking about or talking to, and just get outside feedback, because recognize that fields, whether it's communications or political science or anything else, are not monolithic. And academics, for example, if you're thinking about grad schools, have their own biases. That said, there is this distinction between substance and methods that you see a lot when people do this sort of thing. Oh, that's just a methods thing. Or what are the substantive questions? So start with substance. One of the challenges that I think you're going to need to face on the substance is what do differences mean? You've named your team bias. You're talking about bias, but you have a bunch of different concepts floating around here. You've got bias, you've got viewpoint, and you've also just got, well, they're two different sources, and not every difference is a bias difference. And the methods that you're using, topic models, for example, will capture differences in stuff that people are talking about. And modeling jointly with some variable that you care about, like the source of the information, is a step in the right direction. But I think you're going to need to develop an understanding of the sort of the theoretical background in how people think about these. What do distinctions mean? So one thing you didn't mention, for example, is the literature on framing, where framing is something studied in communication, studied in political science, and in journalism very much as well, under the heading of media bias sometimes. And I think the notion of emphasis framing, you're talking about the same thing, but what aspects of it are you emphasizing, is going to be a useful theoretical construct where you can appeal to an existing literature rather than having to invent stuff yourself. I think another interesting substance challenge that you're going to have has to do with generalizability, right? So the question of whether a study that you're doing about the Cold War as a proof of concept, a question that should be asked at the end of that timeline by somebody, whether it's me or somebody else, is, to what extent does what you've learned from this study tell us anything about anything other than the Cold War and Wikipedia? Whether you're talking about, is this really Wikipedia specific or not? Is this Cold War specific or not? Is this, going back to what you were saying, idiosyncratic to the particular sub-Wikipedias that you chose, Russian versus Spanish and so forth? So there's going to be a substantive question that you should be prepared for about generalizability. In an ideal world, you develop your methods, you prototype them, you show that they worked on the thing that you're talking about, and then you do at least a proof of concept follow-on study saying, now that we've vetted these methods, now let's go look at issue Y instead of issue X, or language Z instead of languages A and D. Not saying you have to include that in what you do, but that's the kind of thinking you want to do in terms of that particular brand of substantive question. In terms of methods, I didn't hear as much, and forgive me, I read this in time for the original meeting that ended up getting rescheduled, so I may have forgotten that it's in here. But there's a bunch of data wrangling that's going to have to take place, right? Getting Wikipedia, normalizing it, and do not underestimate the amount of work it is going to take to get the data into some form that you know full well, some form that you're going to get into. Try to use as standard off-the-shelf and as much off-the-shelf rather than custom stuff as you possibly can when it comes to things like sentence-breaking tokenization, all the rest of that, whether it's Stanford Core NLP or Apache Open NLP or whatever it is. Don't be writing your own tokenizers. Don't be focus on the problems that you want to focus on in this, not the enabling things that is just, well, anybody would have to do this. Chances are most people, most of the things that you need done, somebody's done to some extent as it is. Once you get to other languages, that gets harder, right? So it may mitigate for Apache Open NLP instead of Stanford Core NLP because they may have more models for more languages, for example, that exist, right? So that's a methods sort of issue to pay a lot of attention to.
Phil,
yes.
can I ask,
Sure.
They had planned to build a mini test corpus,
Right.
both for the purposes of doing a pilot on the annotation scheme and building a baseline to produce, just to see if they could produce outputs that could be compared to each other. Do you have any suggestions about like the steps to go for scaling up from a tiny proof to?
Well, I guess my first question would be, should this actually be a mini corpus that comes? Should you get your methods chops going on Wikipedia, or why not pick an existing standard corpus that's out there, right? And get the models and stuff working, make sure, because for example, topic modeling, there's a lot of black art to it. There's sort of hyperparameter tuning being a huge issue, for example. So why not start with Lillian Lee's congressional bills corpus, or the Supreme Court oral arguments corpus, or Amazon product review? It practically doesn't matter. Find corpora. There may be multilingual corpora where you have a variable that is sorry. Just because I state it forcefully doesn't mean it's right. But one path would be to find a dependent variable, regression variable in the topic modeling, supervised topic modeling sense, that is close enough to something you care about, sentiment or tone or something else, and a corpus where you have that's of reasonable size. Get your methods working so that you get interpretable topic models coming out, for example. Right? Learn how to tweak stuff. This is the general scientific practice of try to vary only one variable at a time. Wikipedia versus other stuff is already a variable that different from other stuff. So get stuff going instead of on a prototype corpus, on a reasonably large corpus. One of the advantages of that, by the way, is that anything you can do on a large corpus, you can do on a small corpus. Just ignore 9/10 of the corpus. And this is done in machine translation, for example, where you say, well, how would we do if we only had a small amount of training data? Well, you could work on a language like Uzbek, where you can only get a small amount of training data. Or you could work on Chinese, where you've got gobs of training data, and now you can actually do a study and say, well, let's pretend we had only as much as we have for Uzbek. How much does it get better if we could double the amount of data? What if we could quadruple it? What if we could whatever? And that now becomes a variable. You can't do that if you start with small amounts of data and you only have that available. So that's methodologically a thing to think about.
So now the university has a LDC license.
Oh yeah,
LDC license.
I'm the
so,
LDC contact person.
So we can get access to anything in the LDC catalog through the university, and it doesn't cost anything.
That's right. That's right. And there's tons of stuff out there that is not distributed through LDC, but nonetheless it's such and such a corpus. And available for download, for research purposes or whatever. Yeah. One or two other things, and then I'll stop. So I think. Two related literature observations, just things to look into. One, this is going to happen to you. You're going to be people in your audience who say, there's this paper that I wrote. So there's a paper by Tae, T-A-E is her first name, Yano, Y-A-N-O, Noah Smith and me. I forget the exact title, but it makes reference to like the 1,000 points of light thing. So points of light is in the title. So if you like Yano Smith Resnick points of light, just Google that, you'll find the paper, or ask me. Where we actually had people look at little pieces of text and rate bias on a liberal-conservative spectrum. So there's a previous literature case study where somebody's taken a stab at getting people to do something similar to what you're doing. There's also a paper by, and I think we may have cited it, or they may have cited us, one of the authors, her name is, and I don't know how to pronounce it, she's French, Recasens, R-E-C-A-S-E-N-S. I think she may have done the work with Dan Jarafsky, or at least been at Stanford, who also has done some. Those are starters into Google Scholar, where you look at who they've cited and who cited them for other things that are similar.
I think I read the Recasens paper.
Yeah. Good. Is that how it's pronounced? I have no idea. Okay. Also, I believe, and this may be a paper that you cited toward the beginning of your presentation. Lillian Lee, or at least a student of hers, I'm pretty sure, has done work on NPOV looking at edits as a source of non-neutral, as evidence. How can you get evidence that something was not neutral? Well, look at somebody who's labeled it as NPOV.
And then they tried to pick out the word that made it biased. or
Yeah,
something.
right, exactly. Okay,
Yeah,
you've seen
okay.
that too. Finally, a couple of logistical things. One, you're going to build a really nice data resource for the community by doing this. If you publish, and even not publish, even if it's just a technical report, or you put it on archive, if you're familiar with that ARXIV,
Their thesis will be published.
yeah, whatever it is, here's a great way to get attention and citations. You put up a web page, here's the corpus, here's the documentation, here's the description, here's you downloaded. If you use this, here is the thing to cite. And everybody who uses it now cites you. That's actually a really good thing. It gets your visibility up there. By the way, you're building an amazing resource here. I don't know how many videos you have, where you have video and audio, where you have a document, you have an audio, right?
Yeah.
You have a discussion about it, and in principle, you have somebody's notes on the discussion for work in things like text summarization and other stuff. You could have a gemstone project that uses the gemstone projects as its purpose. Just as an aside.
Sounds like a great idea. Who would fund this?
Right. So, one or two other logistical things. You said that the IRB, that you were going to do an IRB. I'm not convinced that you actually need IRB approval for this.
we're not going to fix that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't.
The criteria here are, if you are studying humans for the purposes of generalizable, if they're human subjects, the people who ought, if you are simply using products created by humans to try to build technology to do something, if your goal is not to study the people, you don't need IRB approval, and in my opinion, you don't need, now, as an educational exercise, writing the document that you have to submit to get the IRB to review and tell you if you need their approval might not be a bad thing for people who are interested in social science. But if you get people to translate sentences for you, right, and then you use those sentences, if you get people to label sentences for you, and all you're doing is using that to build and evaluate a system, I've already done this, I spoke with the IRB manager about this, you don't need approval. Now, here's the really interesting thing. If the intent is different, if you decide, oh, I've got this interesting data, now I'm really interested in whether people who are conservative label things differently from people who are liberal. All of a sudden now the same data does, I mean, it's actually all about the intent. So if you think you might be using it, so that's a reason to go through this process. Two last things. One, is in your budget, you mentioned a local computational linguistics conference. I'm not aware of any local computational linguistics conferences anytime soon. So just bear that in mind. However, there are other things locally. There is an NLP meetup in DC where it might very well, you get NLP people from industry and academia just come into a meetup and somebody presents and then there's discussion. You do that. There's the colloquia.
There are colloquia right
There are
on campus.
colloquia on campus, etc.
There are government organizations that host weekly technology discussions.
Right.
Yeah, there's many venues to present.
That's right. And finally, you mentioned coding up joint LDA from scratch. Don't code anything from scratch unless you need to. There's a trade-off. On the one hand, you can get up to speed quickly on somebody's pre-existing code. On the other end of the consideration is somebody else's code never does exactly what it was that you wanted to do, and so there's a balance. Think about that trade-off. I have a personal bias. If there are decent hammers out there, find a way to make your problem look like a nail. The joint LDA thing is an example. So for example, there is existing supervised LDA code out there. Another grad student of mine who graduated relatively recently has implementations that are really nicely usable of LDA, supervised LDA, something else called supervised nested LDA, which gives you hierarchies with a regression variable. Unless it's like I'm planning to go to grad school specifically in computer science, and I want to have demonstrated my chops at understanding the models and being able to implement them, which is a perfectly legitimate thing, that's great. But if the tool is just a tool for this end purpose, really think seriously about whether to do that, because it really limits you. The amount of time you spend on one implementation from scratch, you might be able to spend trying out 5 different approaches to the problem using other people's software. And so think about that.
Who's the author?
Viet hyphen an A-N Nguyen, N-G-U-Y-E-N. And his code is up on GitHub, and I can provide you with a pointer.
And who was?
And I've got, by the way, a different student, a master student of mine, has written some nice Python wrappers around that code.
Oh, excellent. And who was the postdoc who had done work on the Find Me Similar documents?
Amitai Axelrod.
Axelrod.
Yeah, and it's the buzzword in the search term is data selection.
All right.
So, sorry,
Fantastic.
I know I went on and on.
That's great input, I think, for the team. Dave, you have some things you want to follow up with specifically?
Can you say just 1 or 2 words about what would be the use case? Like assuming success, who's the target user of this, and what sort of problems can they solve that either they could solve faster, or that they could, or that are now tractable that weren't previously tractable?
I guess I guess it kind of depends on that question of like generalizability, right? So if it could like expand to a lot of people, then yeah, I think like social scientists would be interested in it. And I think even if we didn't get there would be a lot of, even like there are like English professors or like literature professors studying Wikipedia. So if you had all these findings, like we say like, okay, the data shows this type of bias, and then maybe they would do the work of connecting it, like developing like a theoretical framework. Like that would be really interesting. So that's like, if it's really generalizable. But if it isn't, I think one thing would, like, maybe just Wikipedia would be interested in that, in knowing, like they do research on themselves of, like, yeah, these kind of biases and, like, who's doing stuff. So I think it would, I guess, like, worst case scenario, it would fall into that.
How about journalists?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see whether or not your techniques and your methods generalize to journalism. Yeah. I mean, substitute the output of every newsroom in every Spanish newsroom,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
or the output of every English language newsroom.
Or look at European coverage of Donald Trump over the last week versus the American liberal media versus the American conservative media.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Some more?
Nope.
Want to do something?
Okay.
All right. A couple of questions. You talked about getting native language readers to updo the selection. How are you going to identify those people? Who are they?
That's something we're currently working on. So we're hoping by the summer we'll have a plan for how to get all the annotations.
Uh-huh.
And we're either looking at using some kind of online resource like Mechanical Turk, or using, or possibly even trying to recruit people who actually have like a lot of knowledge about the situation. So like people who study history.
Okay.
A suggestion, by the way,
Yeah.
on Mechanical Turk you will find people who cheat.
Right.
They'll accept the task in Russian and try to use Google Translate, for example. One way that you can help avoid cheaters, this works nicely with Arabic in particular, anything particularly that has a non-Roman thing, is you can give them an image, therefore they can't cut and paste it, right? And ask them a question about the image of some kind, or even just simply ask them to type the word back in. If you don't have a Russian keyboard, they're not going to be able to type Cyrillic back in. So there's Chris Callison-Birch, who's now at UPenn, is sort of a master of this sort of stuff, and there are a couple of little tricks like that can help filter.
And I would just add, like, don't underestimate the amount of time that it takes to get Mechanical Turk to do what you think it should do.
Yeah.
I mean, you could spend months iterating and trying this and that and trying different tricks to see if it really does what
You
you
might
hope
consider
it'll do.
Cloudflower.
Yeah, I've looked at that.
Which builds in some of the infrastructure that you might otherwise have to build yourself. For example, adding in questions where you are clear on what the answer should be, sneaking those in, and if people get too many of those wrong, then you can assume they're cheating or not trying, and like cut them off, right? On Mechanical Turk, you have to do that sort of thing yourself. Crowdflower, you pay an extra some percent, and they automate that for you.
I used Mechanical Turk for the first time last night. It was a disaster. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, one question about your budget. I will say you guys get the award for the most modest budget of any gemstone people.
Can I make the suggestion that you increase your budget?
Yeah. There's plenty of room for you to go to conferences not within a 20-mile radius. I mean, there's project as outlined is very inexpensive. So don't limit yourself. There's I don't think I've said this at all this year, but there's room for you to grow your budget. Usually it's the other lesson we're trying to learn. So plan. If you need resources, let us know. You have that $600 allocation per year, so you have at least 3 times that to work with. And there's other funds available, so don't cut yourself short.
Plus, it's probably within the university. My guess is for undergraduates doing research, there's probably some other pot of money you can apply for travel funds and that kind of stuff.
There's
Or
different
through your
pots.
departments.
Yeah, there's different pots around. And the other trivial question I have, in your opening map of Latin America, why is Venezuela not part of Latin America?
Ooh.
I think it was Venezuela. In there,
Oh yeah, that's so weird.
why is that?
My guess is it came from a Wikipedia page about Venezuela, and they were picking out Venezuela.
Wait, is that
That'd be my,
Venezuela?
or
what
whatever
is-
country that is.
No, it's not. It's too far
I
east.
think that's Spanish speaking.
That's Suriname?
Is that Suriname? Yeah, Venezuela's over to the
French.
west further.
Or French Guiana?
Yeah,
Oh.
Is that Spanish speaking?
yeah.
Then what about Brazil?
Oh, yeah.
That's a big chunk. Okay, just that kind of gets me thinking about images.
Yeah.
Okay, so you stole that image. You utilized that image from some resource, and it drew my attention because I wanted to know why it wasn't what I thought it looked like. You need to cite every image you're using from somewhere else on the slide where you're presenting.
In a teeny tiny font in the corner.
Right.
Just stick the URL in like mostly grayed out, so that it doesn't distract people. It's
Yeah.
the it's just a CYA.
Right. And if you have an image that you created, it's a really cool description image, claim it. Put your name on it. Whoever drew it, claim it, so that someone doesn't say, "Where did you get that from?" Say, "Well, it's ours."
And in your final thesis, if you do include images that you create, put your name on it. If someone else has created them, because it's published through Drum, your librarian can help you, but you do need to get permission to reprint it because
Right.
it's copyrighted for their thesis.
Really?
Yes, but they have a librarian that is working with their team.
Oh, well, I'm a little confused. This would not fall under fair use?
It does, but the librarians have all advised the gemstone teams for their final theses to make sure that they do the permissions.
Seek
They-
permission for
They
use.
always.
For every image that they okay. I
But
would
if they
res-
tell you can't use it, you can use it anyway because it's legal.
yeah, I would respectfully submit that you want your gemstone people spending time on stuff that is not that.
Yeah.
That's just as far as I'm concerned. If you want, make them read a 3-page thing about fair use and like answer 3 questions about it, and they can do that in like 10 minutes. But having them we just spent way the hell too much time talking about it right now. It's just not a good use of their time. I would push back very hard on the librarians about this. That's just silly.
Yep. Some things are very traditional in some corners of the world.
It
Okay.
doesn't hurt to just talk to your team librarian. And then the IRB determination form won't take as much time as a full IRB packet. I agree, I don't think you need the IRB.
It's a good exercise.
But doing the determination form won't take you as long, and that at least then gives you the experience of doing that, and also if they say you do need to go through IRB, you find out before you start recruiting participants.
If you would like examples of approved IRB protocols, including, I think I have at least one that involves Mechanical Turk, send me mail and I'm sure I can share it.
And Team Judgment also did use Mechanical Turk, so you could talk to Becky, who was your SL, or others from her team, and they did experience some various challenges using that. And they were only English speaking. Their sample was pretty easy to find, and they definitely had some issues.
I just thought of another question. When you're,
No,
when
no,
you're
no.
done.
And the last thing that we don't have to discuss, but I've asked every team, and you should consider, is how you all will hold each other accountable and communicate as you progress through the next 2 years.
That's it. That's exactly where I was going to go. Communication strategy and logistics. You guys should give some serious thought to how you're going to organize this, what tools you're going to use. Trello as one example. I don't know if you've used Trello before. Is something that people use. Streak is another. I'm sorry, not Streak.
Slack.
Thank you, Slack.
Yeah.
Streak is also very useful, by the way. It's a different kind of tool. It's a Gmail plugin for who have I contacted and where are, if you have processes that have pipelines of people. I spoke to so and so. They've gone from I should talk to them to I've talked to them to I followed up with them. Streak is a Gmail plugin. It's useful for that. Salespeople use that sort of thing. But you can use it for paper writing, for example. I've got this, and now I can move that. You should just do a little bit of recon on tools. Slack is really popular right
I've
now.
been using it actually.
Yeah, we've been using Slack. I mean, generally, like what you're getting at is like a lot of it is because we have people that are like more computer programming than like more social science or like humanities.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, developing just those methods of like being able to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, but I've been on an industry project where, for example, you had somebody who was not a computational person using Trello.
Oh, yeah.
It was very intuitive. She was an annotator, or we had a team of annotators, and they had no problem with that sort of thing.
But you might consider having a designated project manager who's who's part of their job is organizing all of the work and making sure everyone's sort of.
Well, that's a nice idea.
I mean, when you have a team that big,
Yeah.
would,
And a lot of
I think
teams do
you kinda
that.
need it.
They have a point person who's the overall manager, coordinator,
And do you guys give them guidance on project management?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
loosely, but
Well,
give guidance.
all right, so we've reached out to Fritz and to set a session to give us guidance on how to use the, we have a Grace space for this project, and there's a GitHub. And so part of that is going to be making decisions about how to get advice about how to get the NLP tools in there so that everybody has access to them.
Right, yeah. But by project management, I'm actually not referring to the technical tools. I'm referring to the idea, for example,
concept.
that what is an action item? An action item is a three-tuple. It has what needs to be done, who is responsible for it, not a set of people, but one person, and a date by which it is due. And if if an action item, if you have a meeting and you have to-do lists and you do not organize things in those at those triples, for example, if it doesn't have a date, then you're
not gonna
already
happen.
setting yourself up for
Right.
trouble.
So
All right.
I have to run, guys. I have to give a presentation across campus. So.
Oh.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This is really, really interesting.
Thanks
feel
for-
free to follow up with me
Yeah.
if you want any other feedback. And,
Thanks for your
forward to it.
support.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
I'm
you.
glad you're feeling better.
I would be happy to chat about stuff like that if
That would be-
over the course of things somebody wants to.
Okay, and we need to wrap up, but the last thing we always like to do is give the team a chance to bounce any questions off us that are nagging you.
Oh, that's a good point. Right off the bat.
I'm actually just curious if you know any specific resources about product management that would be useful to look at.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Not tools, but resources in that sense. None come to mind off the top of my head. I've been using Todoist as a personal to-do list. There's an app
Okay.
called Todoist, and I
Okay.
find it very useful. As a personal project, sort of a personal
Yeah,
thing, and
yeah.
it does have some collaboration support from what I understand.
I'm just curious about things like those action items that you were saying,
Yeah.
where you can learn about.
Yeah, God knows there's people in business schools make entire careers giving advice about this sort of thing.
In the science research, the STEMI research world, there's all kinds of project management software about product flow, thought flow, conclusion flows, who's point of contact, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of round it there. Find one that fits you. Don't try to make one that is not a comfortable ride. But they're all kind of different
Yeah,
shades.
and everybody, it's a little like religion, right? Everyone has its own thing. So there's the getting things done, GTD,
Right.
sort of
My dad's into
philosophy.
that.
Have you seen that one?
I don't know, just like dev using. So I met with Dr. Dakopoulos and he showed me some just a tool to get So it was like, you know, free, and it was like you could put like Wikipedia articles, and you would get like word counts, and you could get like dyads and stuff. Are there any like, you know, easy like out of the box, you know, like word processing things like that you can think of? That
for just off the shelf text analysis?
Yeah, stuff like that.
My recommendation for that would probably be there's various Python tools
Okay.
that make it very easy to do that stuff.
Right.
The pedagogically most useful, like get up to speed quickly to learn stuff, is something called NLTK, or Natural Language Toolkit. It is not state of the art when it comes to the algorithms.
It's not very fast either.
And that's one of the reasons it's not state of the art, absolutely. So if you want to be state of the art, scikit-learn is the way to go.
There's something called Spacey too, which is very fast.
That I'm not familiar with.
Okay.
Yeah. But for the corpora, the size of the corpora that you're dealing with, speed is less an issue than transparency,
Okay.
right? You want, if you write a script or code or something, you want to be able to come back to it 3 months later and be able to understand what you did and be able to explain to somebody else what you did. And so go for transparency and readability every time over efficiency, because nothing in what you're doing, as far as I can tell, scalability would be a different facet of the project that it seems to me is completely irrelevant to the questions you're asking right now.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, because it's
But-
going to shut me up.
but-
Sorry.
But Team BIASES, you guys did a very good job presenting
Yes.
your concept. Your document, I think, was well put together, really clear, especially as someone who is way outside the discipline, which is always fun for me to read those things. This is kind of the point where you guys launch off onto your grand adventure, okay? And we're kind of cutting the umbilical cord here. So we're here to support you as you function through. We will wait to hear from you. Okay, you have a great network already built of professionals who can guide you down that path. But you have a couple benchmarks you need to hit with as you finish out your sophomore year and then the junior year, the colloquia, et cetera, et cetera. So good luck. Go forth.
This is a good omen. You're
Have fun.
in a conference room talking about the Cold War.
Right.